morning. I'm Marissa Llosa. I'm the Conservation Manager for the Houston Parks Board. And today we are at Thomas Bell Foster Park. This is one of our prized green gems along Greens Bayou here. So I'll be walking you guys around this particular site, and we're going to be looking at different types of wetlands. We have both created wetlands and existing wetlands on site. And I think after we have that opportunity, we will actually visit a second property where we have a different type of wetland system. But today, if you can't figure it out, is already going to be all about wetlands. And I'm here to just give you that instruction. My background includes almost 30 years working in different types of wetlands, and all focused on wetland restoration. So that's looking at freshwater systems. I've worked in tidal systems, and mostly in and around the Houston-Galveston area. So wetlands are areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. That's a very fancy way of saying what a wetland is. And really, wetlands are defined by the three factors, essentially. Hydrology, so where your water source is, your vegetation, your dominant vegetation, and then the soils that are also dominant within the complex. I really doubt we're going to get the right pictures, but we can try.
What are we looking for?
So in wetlands, again, they're defined by three different aspects: the hydrology in the area, the prevalent vegetation, and then the soils. So you kind of, in wetland restoration, you're looking to restore all three of those aspects so that you can get all of them working in harmony to restore the system as a whole. But the hardest one to necessarily restore is usually the soils. If the soils were not already saturated soils, it's hard to get it back to those conditions. Now, because like I explained earlier, this used to be a home site, but a home site that was regularly flooded because Greens Bayou is literally right over, just beyond those trees. Right. In fact, actually, you can see the edge right there. This was actually a house that was flooded repeatedly, or used to be a house here, flooded repeatedly. And so my guess is that the water was here a lot, and so these soils may have already gravitated towards saturated conditions. So that's what I was hoping to find, but I'm not sure that we are going to find, because typically when you're doing that, you're looking, you can sort of very vaguely see the mottling that's occurring right there. So these are characteristics that you find in soils that indicate hydric conditions. It's called a mottle, M-O-T-T-L-E-S, and you'll see it at different points in your soil horizon. Let's see if I can find it and make a new one. See, and there's a lot of, because this is not, it was a old house homestead, there's not going to be a lot of features in there. So the soils are going to be really messed up. I think when we get to Cool Green, we'll get to see it, because that site is 70 plus years old, and it's an existing cypress swamp that's been there for so long as part of Greens Bayou that I think when we look at the soils there, it will be very clear. I'll go to the edge and we'll pull those up. But the principles still apply, in that you're trying to restore the soil, the hydric soil conditions, wet soil conditions, restore the water, the hydrology back into the system, and then plant the system with vegetation that is indicative and adapted for those conditions. So like this is a great example. Pickerel weed is what they consider an obligate wetland plant. We have, slip and fall here, Thalia deobata, which is a really beautiful plant, but also very much a deep water species, so very much obligate wetland plant. it does not like to have it dry out. It really doesn't do well. And then of course you have your iris. This is likely Virginica, although it could, no, I think we actually ordered Virginica. And everything we've ordered is stuff that was either collected in this region or native to this region, and that's very, very important because we were talking earlier, you can get another kind of thalia, but the other kind of thalia, which is Thalia genticulata, is native to Florida and is not native to this area. And so bringing that in, it does not behave in the same manner as Deobata, which is adapted for this zone. Genticulata will grow massively and take over an entire system. I've seen it where it chokes out in sections at Clear Lake. There's some bayous that are like little tributaries there, and it is completely overgrown with genticulata.
Marissa, some wetlands smell. What causes that? This does not have that.
It's not powerful.
Yes.
No, that's a great question. So wetlands have varying conditions, and it depends on the hydrology. So when a wetland is inundated, the soils underneath, both the water and the soils underneath, slowly move towards anaerobic conditions. And what happens is the organisms in the soil actually utilize every bit of oxygen that's left within the soil, and then they start to convert their chemical reactions. And so once oxygen is depleted within the soil, then they start using other types of resources. Manganese, they use, gosh, I can't think of all of them right now. I have a cheat sheet for it though.
Okay.
But they will use the next levels of chemicals that they can, and then deplete the oxygen even more so. And those, when they switch that particular chemical reaction, they're moving more into anaerobic conditions. And so one of the things that you see happening when you start moving in that direction is iron is released into the soils, and we'll talk about that more so when we look at some modeling. Manganese increases, but then you also have the presence of hydrogen sulfide, and that's the smell. So when people walk through, and you can really pick up on it in tidal wetlands, and when we get to the other site, we'll have one. When you get to a tidal wetland and it's been really marshy and inundated for a while and it's gone through a lot of cycles, you'll step through that and then you will smell the fumes just pop up, and that's just releasing that. And again, that's part of the whole process of how that changes, and it's related to how these microorganisms are surviving in those conditions, and utilizing what they can and deplete, and as things get depleted, how they move from one reaction or chemical reaction to the next.
Okay, Marissa, do you get that anaerobic effect more in an older wetland?
It will happen fairly quickly if you have the right conditions. So like ideally in a restored wetland, you can see that pretty quickly. But you're right, in like older systems that have been around for a longer time and have been going through that process of the oxygen depletion. So you see that again with, as that process extends over time, older wetlands will tend to have a little bit more of that. And then it also really goes back to how long it's been inundated. So if you think about like cypress swamps, they're always wet. And so they're always in a constant, more often than not, they stay in extended periods of anaerobic conditions because there's no oxygen. And it's very still water, so there's no movement to kind of bring oxygen back into the water column. There's no oxygen that's necessarily in the soil anymore because it's been depleted by the microorganisms because the water's been there for a long time. So you go to places like that, it's very different, and you can see that a little bit more so. And the other really cool thing about like places like that is with that inundation, you also have another aspect that I think is really indicative in wetlands is you don't see the same level of decomposition that you would see in other wetlands like this type of wetland, which is designed to be ephemeral, meaning that it will dry out during the dry season and be wet during the wet season, and it will go back and forth in those cases. When it dries out, decomposition is just like, it's going crazy. So like the leaves that get dropped in, the sticks that are dropped in, all the dead vegetation will get eaten up by detritivores, whatever organisms in the soil. So you'll see that turnover. But in a cypress swamp, very different, because it doesn't really dry out. And so you can go paddling in a cypress swamp and stick your hand down if you can get to the bottom, pull your hand up, and you'll see like almost intact leaves. It's almost a wild thing. Like in a place like this, a leaf wouldn't last. It'd be decomposed almost instantly. But in a cypress swamp, it'll remain intact for quite a long time. It's really neat, and it'll build up that layer of organic peat depending on how old it is. It'll have that material there for a long time. So it's very, well, I would say probably also very nutrient rich as well. I would need to look that one up. We are looking at Cyperus articulatus, and what's really interesting about this plant, and we use this in restoration areas kind of more for the shallow zone because it doesn't really like deep areas. So it actually, from a distance, and even at this point, you can kind of look at it, and it really looks like a juncus, like a rush. And so you look at it and you think, oh my goodness, that should be in the Juncaceae family. But it's actually in the Cyperaceae family, and it has to do with how it has its formed its seed head on the top. And it still does, at the very base, have a leaf sheath. So it's Cyperaceae family, and it definitely has this really cool below ground development in that it has a very thick rhizome, so each one of these guys is probably connected to each other by a really thick rhizome under the ground. So it looks like they might be all individual plants, but really this whole cluster right here is probably all connected with the rhizome between them. And it's a really neat plant. I like it because it can be, if you're thinking about it from a landscaping or a restoration point of view, like you're going back in and restoring the landscape, I just like how it's sparse. And then you put it next to something like this where you have a carex, then it complements each other in terms of how it forms. And then what we've noticed is this morning there's tons and tons of dragonflies. It's the great kind of differential between all the vegetation, which offers places for them to land, places for them to rest, places for them to scout, and then hunt. So I think having that, varied vegetation for all the insects in this area is just really as important to think about it from that point of view as much as restoring a wetland. So the other thing is that you can see these dark marks right there. Those are septa. I'll tear this apart so you can see it. And that septa is another really key giveaway in identification for this plant. You don't see very many plants that have the septa. Now here's the funny thing, is that there's a fair number of rush species, juncuses, that do also. So Juncus nodatus also has septa in there. And then there's a couple Eleochris species that have the septa as well. So it's about kind of putting all of those pieces together for identification when you want to do a positive identification. But I do think it's really neat that if you hold it up to the light, you can see the dark septa lines. It's just neat that plants do that. One of your aspects in doing a restoration is you can plant as many of your desired plants, and we've looked at thalia, we have our juncus over here, we have a variety of different juncus species in our cyperus and our iris, but you also get invasive species that will come in. And so like alligator weed, which is a great example of of a plant that has been around since the 1840s. It was introduced, and I believe, if I remember the correct article, they were talking about one of the ports of introduction was in New Orleans. Yay! But, at that time, I think, with ballast water, I think people weren't really very savvy about how they were transporting things. Now it's very much a big deal, just because we've seen so many invasives come in that way. But, so it was introduced quite a long time ago, but you still see it, and it's pervasive in the system. So what has likely happened in this case is that Green's Bayou, which is again right over the hill over there, probably has a fair amount of it along this, and actually if we go to the edge we'll see it. It has a lot of it there, and any kind of flooding event, the bayou will come back into your restoration site and will introduce all the noxious weeds that you don't want to have. So we actually work towards trying to put in all the good stuff, which will eventually overtake the bad stuff, and that's the hope. But we do actually have a contractor that comes in here regularly, and we'll weed it, we'll get rid of it, so that we can kind of keep that suppressed as long as possible. It's really interesting, you know, you don't realize how close you are to Green's Bayou until you kind of come along the trail. But then if you walk just a little bit over this in the direction, you will be right on top of Green's Bayou, and you can kind of see right there. What we've done is we kind of took the model of riparian restoration that was really kind of brought together and pushed by Kelly Andrasic with the Natural Resource Program from HYDROLOGY, and we've cleared out all the invasive trees and understory in this section, and we've replaced it with a variety of different trees, all native to the region. We utilized her list and her recommendations as well, and we've restored the edge back to native trees, and we've actually, it's hard to see it right now, but we actually have put them down all the way as far as we could get, down to the channel itself. And the idea will be that it'll take some time for these trees to kind of get up and get as large as we want them to be, but once they are established and as they get to their ideal mature height, then you'll have a soft shoreline that has the right tools to maintain the shoreline intact, and ideally kind of help against erosional processes when the channel is either in flood stage or just during storm events, whatever the case may be. So having that edge to kind of help against those forces is exactly what we were looking for, and we'll be putting in more trees, more native trees to this area, wet trees, because they need to tolerate those conditions of inundation, and then also just kind of being high and dry during certain periods of the year.
Wondering, with all the inundation of the waters when there is a major storm that's going to completely flood this, how will the new plantings of the trees will hold up to that?
Well, ideally that goes back to selecting the right plants for the right area. So we looked for species that would tolerate having that inundation period, and I want to point out one specific tree over here. Our lovely cypress trees, Taxodium distilicum. Bald cypress. We'll just go with that, bald cypress. So it's actually very well adapted to these conditions. We actually also put in sweet gum, which is also likes those conditions, wet conditions. We had, I think we chose some hackberries as well, which I know doesn't seem like an ideal, but we have some pines in here. I believe we have some water oaks as well that we selected. I actually was looking at cottonwoods and sycamores as well. So I'd have to go, yeah, so here's your oak tree. So we tried to select those species that would tolerate, again, being kind of high and dry during certain periods, but then when it really floods, like Tropical Storm Imelda, this entire park was underwater. So these trees would have water like up to their necks kind of thing. So they needed to be able to tolerate that. So looking at the cottonwood, for me it's just like another indicator of what we would like the shoreline to kind of be restored back to. Is you can see it's doing exactly what we want it to do. It's stabilizing right there, it's growing, it thrives. That cottonwood with the cypress trees and all the other native trees that would have been along this riparian edge were the reason why we had the edge and why it maintained itself even through flooding events and dry events. It's part of that ecosystem for that riparian zone, and that's our goal, is to get it back to that big beautiful native trees right along the edge, shade structure, you know, it's, and then also when they actually reach the end of their life and they fall in, they provide habitat under the water as well. It's that, you know, habitat for small fish in that area, or other organisms that utilize it as spaces to hide inside that riparian zone, in that watered zone. So for us, it's a goal. It's where we're moving towards, and we're trying to get there. And we're not shy about it either. We want to get there. So Thomas Bell Foster Park is one of the parks that Houston Parks Board still owns, and the history is really interesting because many of these what were former lots, they were residential areas, just like what you see across the street from the park here. Same thing, there were a series of lots with houses and people living in the houses. But this area is very much exposed to flood events, and many of those residences experienced significant flooding events. And then Harvey was somewhat of the last straw. The one site where we have the stormwater wetland, that was a house that I believe was basically completely underwater in Harvey, and maybe had a little bit of water above the roof in that particular site. So many of those residences participated in the Buyout Program with Harris County Flood Control, and so they were bought out, and we basically put all those parcels together. Now there's several that are owned, you know, somewhat differently, but we put all that together, and now it is what we know as Thomas Bell Foster Park, and we're at the very eastern edge of it, and this is a tidal wetland. And what you can kind of see here is that this part of it has been, well, the tidal wetland has been here for quite a long time. It's been here, if you look on the aerial photography, it was been on this part of Greens for a very long time, and Greens feeds into it at the very corner in the back right over there, and it does, so this area is inundated at certain periods and then it dries out. So it has that regular cycle that you see in tidally influenced systems, and it's freshwater. But right now, unfortunately, it's dominated by the elephant ear, an exotic invasive plant that you can buy at Home Depot. Please don't buy it. Because it does this. It takes over our natural systems, and it just completely chokes out everything else that could potentially exist in this area. Now, if we walk a little bit further, we can walk towards the first phase of our restoration work that we've done here. What we've done is we've killed or tried to knock back the invasive species, the elephant ear, and then we've replaced it with native vegetation to try and help counterbalance the system at this point. So again, we're, as part of the restoration in this area, we're trying to do anything that could outcompete, which this is a really tough plant. This elephant ear is super, super tough. But we needed plants that could outcompete the elephant ear if we got it suppressed enough. So what we did is we planted maiden cane, we have Juncus effusus in here, and then we also planted this beautiful carex. You can tell the carex, it has this, a W shaped on the edge, is real indicative of carex, and this is either Cruscorvi or it's Hyalina lepus, one of the two species. But what we did is we just planted a ton of plants in here. We also got some of these palmettos. We put more palmettos along the edge. And you can see it's doing a pretty decent job. It's holding these back, but we still have a lot of work to do. So we're doing this in sections, trying to reclaim it in sections. And it will take us time to get to that point, but it's working. And the freeze was amazing for this. all the Ephemeral was gone. There was not a single leaf during the freeze, but all of our native species were up and going, and they got an advantage and they got a head start against these guys, and I think that's why they did so well in trying to suppress the area. But we still have more work to do. This is an example of kind of what we're looking at moving forward. How do we address the shoreline erosion issues? So we actually have a contractor that we're working with right now, Hydric Designs, to give us several nature-based solutions, so like very natural alternatives for shoreline protection for this area. Some of them would include what they call putting in these very, very large toewood trees, like really, really big trees, and then using kind of more naturalized materials. So again, like maybe old trees that were kind of felled and then cut into pieces, and then utilizing them as wave breaks or barrier in the water to kind of really keep the shoreline from continue this erosional process. So we're actually expecting to get that. We've been working on it for quite a while, but we want to get this completed and designed and then actually implement that, and then depending on how successful it is, which we believe it will be very successful, but we also need, to see how it looks. It could be something that we could look to implementation for further in other locations where we have the same kind of issue. So that's a long-term picture. And it's so deceptive because we're so high up. You think, oh, those are little trees, but when you realize how far away they are, then you realize just how big they are and how massive that has to be. So that pond, if you go back and look on Google Earth, that pond's been there over 50 years. If I had to guess, it's probably over 75 years that it's been here. Because this is the old golf course, the Texaco Country Club, and it is now called Cool Green Park, per how we gained ownership. So we do, as the Houston Parks Board, own this facility. And if you look back, as far as you can look back in Google Earth, that pond existed. So it is, now it's probably changed over the years because there's been a lot of disturbance along Green's Bayou, but all in all, it's remained intact, and it's pretty impressive. So when we get down there, you'll see, oh, I didn't bring my shovel to do a soil.
We might have to go back and get
Yeah, I think so. I think that I'll go do that. So we were coming over. This is the second parcel along Greens that we've retained ownership. It was a former golf course, and with time and actually a series of flooding, and Harvey being the last flood, the facilities were basically destroyed during the storms, and then were cleared out, and basically all operations stopped after that. So then now what we've done is we still retain ownership for this 160 plus acres of parcel of green area in the middle of East Side Houston, which is mostly industrialized areas. There's a lot of pipe yards. In fact, further down the street over here, there's a couple pipe yards and a lot of industrial small facilities. So it's really amazing to think that this is so green, so natural here in the middle of where we think, where we are in the landscape. But again, we're looking at processes to see what we would want to have at this facility. Would we have a pavilion or gathering space for the area? We already are going to be establishing part of our Bayou Greenway trails through this property. So we'll have passive recreation. We know that that's part of what we're planning, but we're in the also process of looking at other options for this facility. But again, with the mindset of keeping it natural, keeping it green, keeping it cool. So looking out, you can see all the beautiful cypress trees, and it might make you think like there's not other trees that are out there, but as we get closer to the edge, you'll start to see a lot of other species that have kind of popped up. And the one that I love is box elder, and that's actually one that you taught me, Shannon. I'm not really good with my trees, but it looks like poison ivy. And if you don't really know, it can totally freak you out. So it's like the sea of box elder. And but then that's really nice because it's what you would expect to see in a wetter area. There's sweet gum and there's a lot of other little trees that are trying to come up in that area. So ideally, when this was still part of the golf course, they actually mowed most of this area. So what we're walking through right now is actually would have been mowed down as turf. And they mowed very far up to the edge. So they didn't get into the pond itself, but that would be probably a reason why you don't see like big trees other than like what's immediately in the pond there, is they pretty maintained it pretty turfed as far out as they could go. So we'll go ahead and head down there. And then of course they had some big shade trees too as part of the whole system. Okay.
And this pond just keeps going?
Yes, it keeps going, and then eventually there is an edge, and then it's immediately connected to Green's Bayou. So whenever Green's Bayou's up, this pond is up.
This pond comes up.
It's
okay.
very much connected to the system. I have not ventured on the other side. That's my wish list.
Ah. You'd need a kayak, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and I actually have a work kayak, so I have no excuse.
Well, when you get ready to do that, let me know. I'll come with you.
Really anything. No mottling like you would expect. So,
The clay looks a lot different.
well, yeah. So,
It's just a completely different sample. A lot more organics in that.
oh yeah, no, well, I've messed it up now, but this is kind of part of that top organic layer that I was talking about where it just doesn't decompose. You can still see some of the original leaves in there, like from the leaves from the cypress trees. Oops. So a lot of it just takes a long time for that to decompose because it's completely anaerobic in there. This is more often than not wet. Every time I've come out here, no matter what time of the year, it is wet. So it's very few opportunities for it to dry out and have that decomposition process kind of kick in. So we might not see very much. Maybe over here.
That's okay, I'm having fun trudging. Well, we might have to dig a little bit more. Woo! Careful.
I'm so used to it. I remember when I was doing work over at Sheldon for all those many years, and I would regularly eat like mud sandwiches. Just par for the course. Cattails are something that a lot of people, when they think of wetlands, they think, oh, well, cattails, that's, a great species in a wetland. And in many places, we definitely have native cattails. There's Typha latifolia, there's Typha domingensis. But what has happened with Typha is they are very, very aggressive colonizers of wet areas. So they can get in, and they have such an incredible tuber and rhizotomous structure that is so thick and tight, and it can survive under pretty adverse conditions. So it spreads. So if it doesn't get it through the underground growth, the 1 million plus seeds in those little hairy pods, the little cattails that everybody knows and recognizes, will colonize bare areas and basically take over as well. So yes, they're native, but they are a very aggressive colonizer that I never utilize cattail in any of my restorations. So cypress trees are one of the common wetland plants that you will find in more swampy areas, areas that are always inundated, always wet. They're an obligate wetland plant. That's the classification that's used by the Corps of Engineers and Fish and Wildlife Service. An obligate plant you will find in a wetland 100% of the time. It's very rare it would be outside of that. A facultative plant can be kind of in between, and then of course an upland plant is in an upland area 100% of the time and very rarely found in a wet area. So cypress trees are well adapted to those conditions, and back in the back you can kind of see one of their major adaptations is having those cypress knees. That allows them to kind of capture more oxygen because, again, like we talked about before, when an area is inundated, the oxygen in that water and in the soil gets depleted very quickly. And if it stays inundated, our plants still need to survive. So they have adaptations to be able to do that. Cypress tree also have a special kind of tissue, which also allows them to kind of absorb oxygen in a different way. So many adaptations you'll see in plants, as well as critters, but plants primarily, that allow them to survive in wet conditions. I'm trying to get to that tree up there. Without like finding a wasp nest, that's what I'm afraid of.
Bushwhacking.